Good morning. I'm Sarah, survivor, author, speaker, clarity coach. I work with women to learn how to become safe, stable, and strong after experiencing abuse. And right now, I want to share my Jesus bubble with you. That's when I spend quality time alone with God right here in my little bubble chair. And I would love to share what I've been reading with you. So, right now, we've been reading through this beautiful book called Hinds' Feet on High Places. It's an allegory about the Christian journey, the faith journey, through sorrow and suffering and away from fear, where fear doesn't control you anymore. The protagonist in our story is a meek, but still kind of fierce young woman named Much Afraid. And right now, she's started on a journey. Excuse me, it's still early. She's started on a journey to the high places with the chief shepherd who's given her two guides, sorrow and suffering. And she's just finished wandering in the desert. After they walked together through the burning desert sands, then one day, quite unexpectedly, a path crossed the main track which they were following. "This," said the shepherd quietly, "is the path which you are now to follow." So they turned westward, with the high places right behind their backs, and came in a little while to the end of the desert. They found themselves on the shore of a great sea. "It is now time for me to leave you, Much Afraid," he said. "I must return to the mountains. Remember, even though you seem to be farther away than ever from the high places and from me, there is really no distance at all separating us. I can cross the desert sands as swiftly as I can leap from the high places to the valleys, and whenever you call for me, I shall come. This is the word I now leave with you. Believe it and practice it with joy. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. Whenever you are willing to obey me, Much Afraid, and to follow the path, you will always be able to hear and recognize my voice, and when you hear it, you must always obey. Remember also that it is always safe to obey my voice, even if it seems to call you to paths which look impossible or even crazy." On saying this, he blessed her and went from them, leaping and bounding over the desert toward the high places, which were now actually right behind her. Much Afraid and her two companions, Sorrow and Suffering, walked along the shores of the great sea for many days. And at first it seemed to her that up until then she had never known real loneliness. The green valley, where all her friends and she had lived, was far away behind her. Even the mountains were out of sight, and there seemed to be nothing in the whole wide world but the endless sandy desert on one side and the endless sea moaning drearily on the other. Nothing grew there. Neither tree nor shrub nor even grass, but the shores were scattered with broken driftwood and with tangled masses of brown and shriveled seaweed. Nothing lived in the whole region save the seagulls wheeling and crying overhead and the crabs scuttling across the sand into their burrows. At intervals, too, an icy wind came shrilling across the billows, stabbing as sharp as a knife. In those days, Much Afraid never let go of the hands of her two companions, and it was amazing how swiftly they helped her along. Stranger still, perhaps, was the way which Much Afraid walked, swifter and more upright than ever before, with scarcely a limp, for something had happened in the wilderness which had left a mark upon her for the rest of her life. It was an inner, secret mark, and no one would have noticed any difference outwardly, but all the same, a deep inner change had taken place which indicated a new stage in her life. She had been down into Egypt and looked upon the grinding stones, the wheel, and the furnace, and knew that they symbolized an experience which she herself must pass through. Somehow, incredible as it was, she, Much Afraid, had been able to accept the knowledge and to acquiesce in it, and she knew within herself that with that acceptance a gulf had opened between herself and her past life, even between her past self, a gulf which could never again be closed. She could look back across it to the green valley between the mountains and see herself there with the shepherd's workers, feeding her little flock, cringing before her relatives and going to the pool morning and evening to keep tryst with the shepherd. But it was looking at somebody else together, and she said to herself, I was that woman, but I am not that woman now. She did not understand how it had happened, but what the shepherd had said had come to pass in herself for those who go down into the furnace of Egypt and find there the flower of acceptance, come up changed and with the stamp of royalty upon them. It is true that Much Afraid did not feel at all royal, and certainly did not as yet look it. Nevertheless, she had been stamped with the mark and would never be the same again. Therefore, though she went with sorrow and suffering, day after day along the shores of the great sea of loneliness, she did not go cringingly or complainingly. Indeed, gradually an impossible thing seemed to be happening. A new kind of joy was springing up in her heart, and she began to find herself noticing beauties in the landscape of which until then she had been quite unconscious. Her heart often thrilled with an inner ecstasy when she caught sight of the sun, shining on the wings of the wheeling seagulls, making them gleam as dazzlingly white as the snow on the peaks of the far-off high places. Even their wild, mournful cries and the moaning of the water stirred in her a sorrow which was strangely beautiful. She had the feeling that somehow, in the very far-off places, perhaps even in far-off ages, there would be a meaning found to all sorrow, and an answer too fair and wonderful to be as yet understood. Often, too, she found herself laughing aloud as she watched the antics of the funny little scuttling crabs. When the sun shone brightly, as it did at times, even the gray, dreary sea was transformed into a thing of surpassing beauty, with the light gleaming on the curving green breakers and the foaming spray and the horizon, blue as a midnight sky. When the sun thus shone on the wild wastes of waters, it seemed as though all their sorrows had been swallowed up in joy, and then she would whisper to herself, When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. One day, they came to a place on the shore where there were high cliffs and great rocks scattered all about. In this place they were to rest for a time, and while there, Much Afraid wandered off by herself. After climbing the cliff, she found herself looking down into a lonely little cove completely enclosed on 3 sides by the cliffs and with nothing in it but driftwood and stranded seaweed. The chief impression it made upon her was its emptiness. It seemed to lie there like an empty heart, watching and longing for the far-off tide which had receded to such a distance it could never again return. When, however, drawn by an urge to revisit the lonely cove, Much Afraid went back to the same spot some hours later, all was changed. The waves were now rushing forward with the strength of a high tide, urging them onward. Looking over the edge of the cliff, she saw that the cove which had been so empty was now filled to the brim. Great waves, roaring and laughing together, were pouring themselves through the narrow inlet and were leaping against the sides, irresistibly taking possession of every empty niche and crevice. On seeing this transformation, she knelt down to the edge of the cliff and built her 3rd altar. "Oh, Lord," she cried, "thank you for leading me here. Behold me, here I am, empty as was this little cove, but waiting your time to be filled to the brim with a flood tide of love." Then she picked up a little piece of quartz and crystal, which was lying on the rocky cliff, and dropped it beside other memorial stones in the little bag, which she carried with her. It was only a short time after the building of that new altar that her enemies were all upon her again. Far away, in the Valley of Humiliation, her relatives had been awaiting the return of Pride with his victim. But as time passed and he did not return and Much Afraid did not reappear, it became obvious that he must have been unsuccessful in his undertaking and was too proud to admit it. They decided that reinforcements must be sent as soon as possible, before Much Afraid could reach the really high places and be altogether beyond their reach. Spies were sent out, who met Pride, and brought back word that Much Afraid was nowhere on the mountains, but was far away on the shores of the Sea of Loneliness. She was going in quite a different direction from the mountains altogether. This was unexpectedly delightful and encouraging news, and quickly suggested to them the best reinforcements to be sent to the help of Pride. There was complete unanimity in deciding that resentment, bitterness, and self-pity should hurry off at once to assist Pride in bringing back Much Afraid to her eagerly awaiting relatives. Off they went to the shores of loneliness, and Much Afraid now had to endure a time of really dreadful assaults. It is true that her enemies soon discovered this was not the same Much Afraid with whom they had to deal. They could never get within close reach because she kept so near to sorrow and suffering and accepted their assistance so much more willingly than before. However, they kept appearing before her, shouting out their horrid suggestions and mocking her until it really seemed that wherever she went, one or another popped up. There were so many hiding places for them among the rocks, and they hurled their darts at her. "I told you so!" Pride would shout viciously. "Where are you now, you little fool? Up on the high places? Not much. Did you know that everyone in the Valley of Humiliation knows about this, and they're laughing at you? Seeking your heart's desire, eh? And left abandoned by him, just as I warned you. On the shores of loneliness. Why didn't you listen to me, you silly fool?" Then resentment would raise his head over another rock. He was extremely ugly to look at, but his was a horribly fascinating ugliness. Sometimes Much Afraid could hardly turn her eyes away when he stared at her boldly and shouted, "You know, Much Afraid, you act like a blind idiot. Who is this shepherd you follow? What sort of a person is he to demand everything you have and take everything you offer and give nothing in return but suffering and sorrow and ridicule and shame? Why do you let him treat you like this? Stand up for yourself and demand that he fulfill his promise and take you at once to the high places. If not, tell him that you feel absolved from all necessity to follow him any longer." Bitterness would then break in with his sneering voice. "The more you yield to him, the more he will demand from you. He is cruel to you and takes advantage of your devotion. All he has demanded from you so far is nothing to what he will demand from you if you persist in following him. He lets his followers, yes, even women and children, go to concentration camps and torture chambers and hideous deaths of all kinds. Could you bear that, you little whiner? Then you better pull out and leave him before he demands the uttermost sacrifice of all. Sooner or later, he'll put you on a cross of some sort and abandon you to it." Self-pity would chime in next, in some dreadful way. He was almost worse than any of the others. He talked so softly and in such a pitying tone that Much Afraid would feel weak all over. "Poor little Much Afraid," he would whisper. "It is too bad, you know. You really are so devoted, and you've refused him nothing, absolutely nothing. Yet this is the cruel way in which he treats you. Can you really believe when he acts toward you like this that he loves you and has your real good at heart? How can that be possible? You have every right to feel sorry for yourself, even if you are perfectly willing to suffer for his sake. At least other people ought to know about it and pity you instead of misunderstanding and ridiculing you like they do. It really seems as though the one you follow takes delight in making you suffer and leaving you to be misunderstood. For every time you yield to him, he thinks of some new way of wounding you and bruising you." That last remark of Self-Pity's was a mistake, because the word bruising suddenly reminded Much Afraid of what the shepherd had said when they stood together on the threshing floor in the pyramid in Egypt. "Bread corn is bruised," he had said, "but no one threshes it forever, only until it is ready to be made bread for others. This also comes forth from the Lord of hosts, who is wonderful in counsel and excellent in working." Isaiah 28. When she thought of this, to Self-Pity's dismayed astonishment, Much Afraid actually picked up a piece of rock and hurled it at him. And as he said afterwards to the other three in an aggrieved tone of voice, "If I hadn't ducked and bolted like a hare, it could have laid me out altogether." But it is exhausting to be assaulted day after day with suggestions like these, and while sorrow and suffering were holding her hands, naturally Much Afraid could not cover her ears, so her enemies were really able to give her a dreadful time, and at last things came to a crisis. One day, When her companions actually seemed to be sleeping for a little while, Much Afraid unwarily wandered off alone. Not this time to her favorite spot looking down into the little cove, but in a new direction. And she came to a place where the cliffs jutted out into the sea, forming a very narrow peninsula, which ended in a sheer precipice. Nothing, this could go wrong, right? No way this could go wrong. When she reached the end of this promontory, she stood looking out over the endless expanse of the sea, and suddenly found, to her horror, all 4 of her enemies approaching and closing in on her. That already she was becoming a different person was then quite apparent, for instead of nearly fainting with fright at their approach, although she did look very pale and frightened, she actually seized a stone in each hand, and putting her back against a great rock, prepared to resist them to the limit of her strength. Fortunately, the place was too narrow for all 4 to approach together, but Pride put himself in front of the others and stepped toward her, holding a strong cudgel. "You can put down those stones, Much Afraid," he said savagely. "There are 4 of us here, and we mean to do as we please with you now that you are in our power. You shall not only listen to us, but you shall come with us." Much Afraid lifted her face toward the seemingly empty sky, and with all her strength called out, "Come to my deliverance, O my lord!" To the horror of the 4 ruffians, there was the shepherd himself, leaping toward them along the narrow promontory, more terrible than a great mountain stag with thrusting horns. Resentment, bitterness, and self-pity managed to hurl themselves flat on the ground and edge away as he bounded toward the place where Pride was just seizing hold of Much Afraid. Catching him by the shoulders, the shepherd spun him around, lifted him in the air, where he uttered a loud, despairing shriek, and then dropped him over the edge of the cliff into the sea. "Oh, shepherd!" gasped Much Afraid, shaking with relief and hope. "Thank you! Do you think Pride is really dead at last?" "No," said the shepherd. "It is most unlikely." He glanced over the cliff as he spoke, and caught sight of Pride swimming like a fish toward the shore, and added, "There he goes, but he has had a fall today which he will not forget, and I fancy he will limp for some time to come. As for the other 3, they've made off into some hiding place and are not likely to trouble you again in the same way now that they realize that I am within a call." "Shepherd," Much Afraid asked earnestly, "tell me why I nearly got into Pride's clutches again, and why resentment, bitterness, and self-pity have been able to pester me for so long in this dreadful way. I did not call you before because they never dared to come close to me or make a real attack, but they've been lurking around me all the time and making their horrible suggestions, and I couldn't get away from them. Why was it?" "I think," said the shepherd gently, "that lately the way seemed a little easier, and the sun was shining, and you came to a place where you could rest. You forgot for a while that you were my little handmaiden, Acceptance with Joy, and were beginning to tell yourself that it really was time that I led you back to the mountains and up to the high places. When you wear the weed of impatience in your heart instead of the flower of acceptance with joy, you will always find that your enemies get an advantage over you." Much Afraid blushed. She knew how right he was in his diagnosis. It had been easier to accept the hard path and to be patient when the sea was gray and dull than now when the sun shone and everything else around looked bright and happy and satisfied. She put her hand in the shepherd's and said sorrowfully, "You are quite right. I have been thinking that you are allowing me to follow this path too long and that you were forgetting your promise." Then she added, looking steadfastly into his face, "But I do tell you now, with all my heart, that you are my shepherd, whose voice I love to hear and obey, and that it is my joy to follow you. You choose, my lord, and I will follow." The shepherd stooped down and picked up a stone, which was lying beside her feet, and said smilingly, "Excuse me. Oh, my goodness. Put this in your bag with the other stones as a memorial of this day, when for the first time you saw Pride toppled over before you, and of your promise that you will wait patiently until I give you your heart's desire." Do you have a memorial stone like that? I know I have a few times where I have simply just had to say, "Okay, God, take away the pride. Bring me back to humility and patience. I don't know when or how you're going to bring all the things that you have promised into life, but help me learn the lessons now that I need to learn along the way." so that I can be ready when you are ready to bring those things. If you're stumbling along in this whole post-trauma journey, trying to figure out the next right steps in the path for you, I would love to work with you in my coaching club called The Scoop. You can see with a link right down beneath. And maybe it's right for a friend. If so, tag a friend underneath or send this video to them. And in the meantime, until tomorrow, thank you for hanging out with me in my Jesus bubble this morning.